morning again. My guess is that most of us hold to the belief that God created the universe out of nothing. In Latin, we call it creatio ex nihilo, creation out of nothing. It's the idea that in the beginning there was nothing until God said, "Let there be light." And then there was light. It's certainly an extraordinary idea. It reinforces, of course, the idea that God is God and we are not. Who else could make something out of nothing? Wouldn't it be great if we humans could do that? Think about how many problems we'd solve by creating something out of nothing. Good health, ample resources. So many of our problems would go away if we could create something out of nothing. Today's gospel is a continuation of the story we've been following for the last several weeks on Sundays. If you remember from last week, Jesus' disciples had returned from their mission, and he was trying to get away with them for some quiet time in a deserted place. And word had gotten out, and the crowds had beaten them to that spot. And rather than be annoyed, Jesus was moved with compassion for them, and he began to teach them. And now that he has finished teaching them, they're hungry. My guess is his sermons were a little bit longer than mine. Not as long as Father Miller's, though. I'll give you that. I'll give you that. So anyway, we pick up at that point in the story. We've actually switched today from the Gospel according to Mark to the Gospel according to John. It's going to be the same event, but John tells it a bit differently and extends it a little bit more. So the church decides to use this version of the feeding of the 5,000. So we're at John chapter 6. The story actually begins at verse 1, but we're just going to pick it up right at verse 5. So Jesus sees the crowd, and he says to Philip, "Where can we buy enough food for them to eat?" He said this to test him, because he himself knew what he was going to do. Now, some scholars think that the disciples have been with Jesus for up to a year by now. And so apparently this test is to see if they have figured out who he is and what he can do and whether they can trust him. So Philip answers, 200 days' wages worth of food would not be enough for each of them to have a little bit. Philip fails the test. And Andrew doesn't do much better. One of his disciples, Andrew, the brother of Simon Peter, said to him, "There's a boy here who has five barley loaves and 2 fish. But what good are these for so many?" You see, for some, it takes time before we can really know who Jesus is, before we can know really what he can do, and before we can trust him. So you can imagine Jesus sighing and says, have the people recline. Now, in the ancient world, reclining was the position in which people ate. Okay, they did not sit in chairs and sit up to a table like we do today. They either laid on the ground or they had couches that were low and they would lie on them. And then the table was low and they would just simply reach over and take their food as they reclined and ate. So by instructing the people to recline, Jesus clearly intends to feed them. Now, there was a great deal of grass in that place, so the men reclined, about 5,000 in number. Now, the first thing to note is if there were 5,000 men, the crowd was at least 10,000 strong by the time you add women and children as well. So this is a huge crowd. Now, you have to imagine the scene here. John tells us there's a large amount of grass, and all of these people now are reclining on the grass. And if you have a good grasp of your scriptures, it should then give rise to the image of the 23rd Psalm. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. So when you see this image, what John is already telling us is Jesus is now fulfilling the role of the shepherd. Remember, his heart was moved for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And since it's the Lord who maketh me to lie down in green pastures, Jesus is the Lord, the good shepherd. Now, he then takes the loaves, gives thanks, and distributes them to those who were reclining. Now you have to listen to these verbs. And a little bit later in Mass, listen to them again when we do the words of consecration. He takes the bread, he gives thanks, and then he distributes the loaves. Okay, this is the language of the Last Supper. So John now is foreshadowing the Eucharist in this scene. In fact, he gave thanks in Greek is Eucharistisas, which means the Eucharist to give thanks. That's where we get our term, the Eucharist, from. So he's now mixing the imagery of the Good Shepherd and the pasture with Jesus at the Last Supper. And he gives them to those who were reclining, and also as much fish as they wanted. And of course, it's going to be as much as they want, because the Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. When the disciples had had their fill, he said to them, "Gather the fragments left over, so that nothing will be wasted." So they collected them and filled 12 wicker baskets with fragments from the 5 barley loaves that had been more than they could eat. Here, and we'll find out a little bit later in the coming weeks, John is beginning to make a comparison between what Jesus is doing in this scene and the feeding of the Israelites with the manna from heaven. If you remember that story, when the Israelites were traveling in the desert and they needed food, God provided them with manna, the bread from heaven. But there was a catch. They could only collect as much manna as they could eat for that day, meaning that God was only going to provide for them on a day-to-day basis. If they tried to collect more and store it, what happened? It spoiled, right? But when Jesus feeds us, when Jesus gives us bread, there is not only enough for today, but there is more left over that can be stored and held forever. And that's the difference between the bread that comes from heaven and the bread that comes from Jesus. Now, it's an amazing story. And there seems to me to be a lot of fuss over feeding 10,000 people with barley bread and fish. I mean, come on, think about it. Couldn't Jesus have just prayed to God and asked God to produce a whole banquet for these people? I mean, quite frankly, barley loaves and dry fish is not high living. But you see, that would have been to ask God to create something out of nothing. And you see, to create something out of nothing at this point in history would have been to imply that creation, as it already existed, wasn't good enough. And you see, God doesn't make junk. And so there is no need anymore for God to create something out of nothing. God can do perfectly well with the world he created. Thank you very much. And that's important for us to remember. Because all too often when we face challenges in life, we sometimes act as though we and this world aren't good enough. Like we were Andrew, who said about the little boy and the loaves and the fishes, well, this is all we've got, but what good is it? So you see, when we ask God to start all over, whether because we're going down the wrong path, or we want everything behind us to be swept away, or whether we feel like we're just not worth as much, and we want God to create us all over again. You see, when we do that, we're implying that creation isn't good enough. And God's got to start over again. But all that God creates is good. And there isn't any need for God to wipe it away or to start over again. God takes us as we are, the way he created us. And God takes us where we are, with all of the choices we've already made. And God can provide for us and move us beyond our basic needs, beyond our wildest dreams, right where we are here and now. Because the Lord is my shepherd, and there is nothing I shall want. Amen. And if we feel like we're still wanting in life, maybe it's not because we're deficient. Maybe it's because we're like Philip and Andrew, and we fail to understand who Jesus is and what he can do, and whether we can trust him. You see, we often fail the same test that Philip and Andrew failed. But that's okay. They turned out all right. God doesn't need to create something out of nothing, because God's grace perfects what he has already created. Our human material being may be limited in this world, but with the grace of God, we can move beyond our limitations. We are made perfect in God's grace, and so there's no need for God to cast us aside and start anew. You see, the miracle of the loaves and the fish isn't so much about God's ability to feed 10,000 people. It's about God's ability to moving from feeding us with the bread from heaven to feeding us with the bread of life. This story is about Jesus providing hungry people with both physical and spiritual nourishment to continue the journey. And that's what Jesus does for us every time we come here to share the Eucharist. We all face difficulties in life, and we often bring them here to the table of the Lord, and that's as it should be. The food that Jesus feeds us with at this table isn't necessarily going to solve every problem that we have in life. We may still leave here without a job, without our health, without a loved one whom we've lost to death. But with faith in who Jesus Christ is and in what Jesus Christ can do, with faith and trust in him, we can leave here nourished with the hope that God can take our lives wherever God finds them and move us closer to his loving embrace. You see, God no longer has to make something out of nothing. He did that once in the beginning, and he'll never have to do it again. Because everything God makes is good. It only needs to be perfected with his grace. And the sooner we realize that, the sooner we'll stop looking for ways for God to remake us and start looking for ways for God to move us beyond who and where we are today. So let God work with you just the way you are. Don't think that you have to be anyone other than who you are. For the Lord is our shepherd, and there is nothing we shall want. Amen.